All right, welcome gang to our, let me look at this, is it the 18th journal club we've had now? The numbers just keep adding up every time. But thank you for joining us on this wonderful Wednesday. Is this still Wednesday? Yes, Wednesday, noon time. I'm Chris Vogel. I'm the president-elect of the Atlanta Area Evaluation Association. And here we will be talking about this one particular article, Enhancing the Effectiveness of Logic Models. Okay, it's working. It's working, good. I don't know how many people had the chance to read the article. You know, you're not required to, or even read the abstract, but I thought it was interesting in a couple different ways, right? This is the first good experimental design of testing a visually appealing way to present logic models. And I say that with some hesitancy because really I think this article, although wonderful in many different domains, it seems to be comparing a logic model that I have never even seen done, maybe in a textbook somewhere. So what I'm guessing is like the older version of a logic model versus, I don't mean to be mean with this, but it's like the bare standard of logic models that we have now. So I just want folks to keep that in mind, or at least it's what I did. I was like, oh, you know, well, I've seen all sorts of different new techniques that have been used beyond this one, and we'll get to that in the discussion for any additional tips that you find folks have for ways to improve it. But as I said, so the authors had 6 different conditions, of which they assigned about 50 people to each condition and presented them with some variation of the logic model. There was, I can pull this up because I'm in presenter mode. So what they're calling the original logic model, and I'll show you a picture of that here in a second, an original with a narrative. So not only are they testing the visual aesthetics of a logic model, but the usefulness of pairing a narrative component with them. The revised edition, revised with a narrative, and then a revised black and white, that's only 5, where the last one is just the narrative. And we'll see pictures of this, but I just wanted to show really the 3 main dimensions that they're testing on here. Visual efficiency, which requires some discussion in and of itself, that really it's a culmination of these 3 facets right here. How accurately can they describe the logic model and the components involved? The amount of time it takes for them to give this response, the level of mental effort, and then how credible they find it and how aesthetically pleasing. If you're interested, they used Amazon MSK, which is that, I've never used it, but I keep hearing it brought up, right? It's you can pay Amazon X amount of money and they have survey participants that you can define by demographics, location, apparently a slew of them, for them to receive your study to take. So that's what they did. I actually thought it was an interesting part of the article that they presented a number of different references or citations that show the worthwhileness of doing this and how it doesn't seem to, using that sample doesn't seem to differ much from the population sample of interest. So if you're looking for what they call crowd-funded survey participants, the beginning of this article where they talk about that might help you out, or at least convincing others the worthwhileness of doing it. All right, so this is what they called the original one. And once again, this is the one I don't, and you know, I'm fairly new in the evaluation world. I've only been doing this for a little over a decade, but I don't think I've ever seen one like this. Maybe a textbook somewhere. The boxes, the lines, those are all pretty common, but the fact that there's no color in it, or any way to differentiate besides the titles, and they did add that little for the outcomes, you know, separating those a little bit differently. And then this was their revised, and it is better, right? They definitely pull in some of the more principles that we have probably been more accustomed to, like the idea that the boxes are very close to one another, if not touching. The arrows themselves have been minimized, the use of color to differentiate between the different portions of the logic model. And then, one step further with this and the long-term outcomes, how even this tan box, whatever we're calling that there, it seems to be their most important variable. The pictures are blocking my way, so if I'm misinterpreting that, is used a different color. And then the inputs, I feel like this is fairly common now, where it's not always an oval, but there's at least some designation to make sure people recognize that those are different from the activities, the reach, the outcomes, all that jazz. So with that, let's talk about what they found. And I didn't have a better, I gotta really move this, the pictures. Oh, no, go back. Go back. I gotta move your pictures because it's blocking me. Okay, so I really couldn't find a better way to present this because maybe I just didn't put enough effort into making the PowerPoints, but I'm really just taking their big charts and letting you see. So it's better to look at these by the variables they're interested in. So first, visual efficiency, where they define this as the extent of cognitive gain relative to the cognitive cost. And they actually have some equation in there that they pull in from another author, Huang, about how this is exactly calculated. But it seems like how much they're able to remember by the amount of effort they put into it. And response time pulls into that as well, if I'm not mistaken. So, as we can see here, there is some really striking differences, right? Overall, between the 6 conditions, they did find meaningfully, or I should just say statistically significant. I always try to shirk away from statistical significance, but that's okay. The revised by itself was a really efficient way of giving the information. And so was the revised black and white. And that's the one I don't have, or I didn't show you because I didn't see it in their supplements, but one could imagine, right? It's the revised version just in black and white. But it does look like the color does help with this sort of ability to both remember it and decrease the cognitive cost on it. Where we see things like the original with the narrative only. Even the original, like it does look like it took some level of effort for people to better understand those, to use those. Then there's response time, right? This is how long it took them to report back what they knew, to actually finish reading it and understanding it. And here we're talking about just in seconds, where the revised by itself, and some of this is fairly intuitive, right? If you're going to have a narrative section in there, it's going to drive it up. I do think it's interesting that the original by itself had a longer response time than the original and the narrative. Maybe that particular group was really focused on understanding it, as opposed to just the revised by itself, which was less than all of them. So it does seem like there is some influence there. If we're looking, and here I couldn't help but think about when to present a type of logic model to a type of audience, that if we're not using a participatory approach to maybe continue to develop it, but rather this is less engaged stakeholders, then I could definitely see this revised helping get across the point, where you might want the revised with the narrative just to be able to say the entire breadth of everything you are meaning to in the logic model. And then, the only problem with presenter mode is I have to then go back to the other one. Okay, then mental effort. So this was one of those components that we talked about that really plays into that whole first one that we looked at, the visual efficiency. So those were all, these two are components of that one. So this mental effort is just the self-reported level of attention required to interpret the logic model and answer the questions, and just measured using a single Likert scale. We can see, right, once again, the revised without a narrative comes in at the best, right, where lower is better if we're interested in decreasing the burden on those looking at the logic model. And I say that not in comparison to the narrative only, right? The narrative didn't seem to take that much mental effort to it. But if we're looking to represent a logic model, then the revised seems to win out. But maybe it's just easy for folks to read the narrative and hopefully get some understanding of it. And that's why they tested accuracy down here. You know, it might be interesting just to present the narrative only because the level of mental effort is low, but the accuracy, now accuracy was measured by using 7 questions about the program and the causal relationships. We can see that actually the narrative only came in the worst. So it might have really low mental effort, but if they're not able to accurately describe the relationships we're trying to show, then that's probably problematic. Where then we see this interesting component here of the revised none and the revised narrative, right? The revised seems to be a better tool for showing folks these relationships and the components of the program, or so they'll remember it, as opposed to the revised and the narrative. And the psychologist in me really pondered this idea because it could just be sheer cognitive load. You know, that they look at the logic model and then they go to read the narrative, and that's just so much information to process that it could decrease their accuracy or their ability to remember it. But either way, they beat out the original. And this is my last one, and then we can talk, I promise. The credibility and aesthetics. So once again, both Likert scale items, looking at how credible the participants felt they were. There was a significant difference in credibility between all those. I mean, just from a practical standpoint, and if I would guess based on the ANOVA, it's that really that difference comes in the lack of credibility with the narrative only. There might be minor differences between like the revised black and white and the revised, and I guess a half of a Likert point on the 7-point scale might be meaningful, but what I would guess is causing it to be statistically significant is the comparison with this narrative only group. So just presenting the narrative by itself, people don't seem to find it's credible. And I'd be interested, and maybe we'll add that to our discussion question about why we think the revised black and white is more credible, perceived credible than the revised. And then aesthetics. So this was what they call, well, it's not what they call it, but what they use is a semantic differential rating scale, where it's a scale specifically created to measure aesthetic perceptions. So they were asked to rate the program depiction, the aesthetically pleasingness of it on a 7-point continuum of polar adjectives, from like ugly to beautiful, confusing to clear, boring to engaging. And we see the winner of that one, if there is a winner, is definitely the revised narrative, but with the narrative, but only slightly when compared to the revised none. That they didn't ask this for the narrative group, as one can imagine, because it's just text. That would very well throw off the ANOVA, probably a lot like it did in the credibility one, because text just isn't that aesthetically pleasing. So I think the big takeaways we had from here are that using colors, grouping principles, does seem to have an impact on how well people remember it, right? How accurate it is. There is some value, at least with the revised narrative and including the narrative, or revised logic model and the narrative, that, that does seem to increase the credibility. And then additionally, that the revised by itself seems to take the least amount of time, right? That color grouping, the closeness of the boxes, that we can understand that quicker. So I'll just throw this up here and let me get back to Zoom. All right. So gang, feel free to unmute yourself. First, I'll just take any thoughts you have. What do you think about these findings?
I was not really surprised by them.
Yeah.
Although I am glad that you shared the actual logic model, because in the the access that I had, I couldn't actually see it. So that was helpful. But I don't know. I really wasn't surprised about the findings. I was more surprised that nobody had done this before. Like, it seems pretty obvious to me in a couple of ways. I do think that the information on the narrative was interesting and potentially helpful. I think some people might assume that having a narrative to go along helps people to better understand. And so that finding on that piece was very interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it really made me, and you can probably see this from the second question as well, that, and maybe I'm speaking from the spot of the current federal agency I work with, but a narrative is almost, at least I've always made a logic model with the narrative in my current role. And it seems like maybe that's appropriate, but then sharing that narrative, maybe not always appropriate, right? This idea that we have some mid-level stakeholder or people just trying to learn more about the program, maybe it would be a detriment to share that narrative. And if I should say, like, at the initial point, right? Now, if they come to me the next day and like, hey, do you have a narrative for that? Yes, of course I will. But if we're presenting it to them, maybe just the logic model is the way to go. So yeah, good insight.
Hey there. So this is Michelle. Hi, Chris. Hi there. So I am thinking, I do logic models, but not really for like stakeholders. They're more internal. But it's a surprise, like how little time people want to spend. Like if you send something to someone for feedback, the less cognitive load, the better. Yeah. If you want. So anything to make them easier to read without losing content is like very interesting. So my question would be, if you like, so it's not just a hodgepodge of different techniques, what would be like the priority visualization strategy? Like if you just, would it be like to focus on colors? Would it be to focus on cognitive load? Like what would be like if you had to prioritize a method or strategy?
Well, I will let somebody else chime in and then I'll give my thoughts. If anybody has any ideas about what they would think to prioritize. Because I talk a lot. I like to open it up. Going? All right, only because we're running out of time. I definitely would see that the grouping by colors are important. Now, the closeness of the boxes, I think that's cool. I don't know if that's an absolute must, and maybe it's just because I like playing with the arrows. But yeah, definitely the reduction or the inclusion of color, but also the reduction in the number of words you use, right? The number of characters. I always found that made a big difference when I'm working with nonprofits or even government organizations. Some people want to put a lot of stuff in there, and just to make it as succinct as possible is the best way to go. But then, yeah, there needs to be this way for people to remember it, right? Some way to make it, not to use this cliche term, but I will anyway, sticky, right? And it seems like color groupings do that, but they need a little amount of text to make them sticky. And as
okay,
always,
thanks.
One of the, go on, yes.
Real quick, I mean, to me, I would think maybe something relating to the theory of, what does the theory of change tell you would be most useful? Because I was sort of surprised that colors just indicating the different columns were so helpful. When you can see clear paths, groupings of activities through outcomes and things like that, that's when I usually am more inclined to use color to demonstrate some other piece of how you're moving through the theory of change. So it was interesting to me to see that such a blunt use of color made a difference. But to Michelle's question, I would like, is there something that the theory of change tells you would be useful?
Yeah, that's a great idea, Sarah. So yeah, no, perfect. I'm just trying to think, maybe I should have done that approach on some of mine. And I want to throw out there, one of these days I'll extend this to 12:30, but if you need to hop off, you won't offend me, but I love talking about logic models. So I'll stay on. One thing that I thought was interesting, and I keep finding it more and more people like this when I use it at my current job, is, let me go back, the inclusion of swim lanes with logic models. And it always makes me nervous because it adds more to a logic model, generally when I'm trying to increase things. But at least when I'm working with a team, and I should say swim lanes, if you're familiar with those, it's really come out of process mapping and quality improvement, to where you could say like this top portion of this logic model belongs in the realm of, I don't know, some particular program or division or group within your organization, and this next one belongs, and I'm using air quote, oh, you can see me, that's a belongs, and that there is overlap between those, and I always point those out. But that's one thing that I've at least found when I'm presenting with people that represent different groups or different components of the program to be helpful. You just have to be really mindful about how you present that so it doesn't add too much cognitive burden to this. I used to keep them as swim lanes, but they became kind of cluttered, like the actual lines that go horizontally across this. So far I found what works best is to change the border on these boxes. So like this top one would be something about, or something like dashes around it, or dots around the next one or something like that. So you can, anyway, that's one thing I found people like. Does anybody else have any other sort of visualizations that they think just make it awesome?
What about, this is Michelle again. What about highlighting, so one evaluation webinar suggested starting with the outputs, or no, sorry, the outcomes. And so I'm wondering, would it be helpful to have people start at the outcomes, and like, would it be helpful to reverse the order of the columns or flip it?
Oh, so good question. Now, when I do part or collaborative logic model creation, I always start at the far right-hand side of it and then work my way backwards. But as you're asking about actually presenting them, that's interesting. I've never thought about that, but it might be useful. If I just had to present one thing about, or one rebuttal that other people would have, maybe it's the temporal nature of a logic model that they're trying to depict. But I would bet that like there would be a really nifty way to show it the other way around, if we're really trying to emphasize the importance of what it is we're doing. Then
Yeah, because I found that a lot of people don't read the outputs, or the outcomes. Like when I ask for feedback, I usually get feedback on the activities and strategies. And sometimes I feel like if there's a good understanding of the outcomes, or if they read the outcomes, the activities would be easier to interpret. So I'm wondering if there's like a way to visually present that, so people can make the connection between the activities and outcomes with, without having this, having to like move their eyes back and forth.
Yeah, no, that's a great thought. Because most people know these first, and even this one doesn't have the outputs, but we can imagine reaches outputs. Most people you present to have a good understanding of those, but what we're really trying to help them understand is this outcomes and impact level. But we lose them, right? And I like that. Michelle, when you figure that out, let me know, because it's a burden.
Yeah, we can write something up.
I like it.
Be a publication.
Let's do it.
Yeah, I was gonna.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, like, just kind of, there are kind of two things that this logic model made me think of. One, I really like the inclusion of reach, because when like I was originally trained in logic models, it was a very messy discussion about, where does the audience go? Like, are they an input? Are they receiving? Like, how do they are incorporated in this logic model. So I think adding a reach column is a really neat way of like, you know, identifying that like they might not necessarily, you know, actively be like, you know, like an input of the logic model, but they are receiving at least, you know, like if there are communication aspects or like different things in the program that they might be passively, you know, that might passively involve them in the logic model. So I really like the reach. And then I also too, because my experience with logic modeling has been like working, you know, like with public health or medical organizations that don't necessarily have the resource to do their own evaluations, or maybe even don't have the resources to carry out all of the activities to get to these outcomes, to get to their ultimate impact. And so something I've seen, which I believe I see here, is that they often want it explicitly stated in the visualization or shown, you know, which of these outcomes from short, medium to long are actually required to, you know, progress to the medium outcome, or to progress to the long outcome, or to progress to the impact outcome, because then that opens a resource conversation of like, what activities can be consolidated, or what activities are maybe won't even be necessary to actually reach these outcomes instead, as far as, you know, kind of, you know, what is the trade-off of like doing more versus doing less. So.
Yeah, no, great point there. And I didn't even pick up on that they did this, but yeah, you're very right. I love it.
I also thought in terms of like the, well, first of all, I'm not Evelyn 21. I was using my supervisor's account because she has a professional account, and I was trying to switch and I couldn't, but anyways, my name is Isabel.
Hi, Isabel.
And I thought, when I was reading the article, I thought, I'm not an expert in either evaluation or data viz, but I do have some experience doing both. And I was envisioning like this really crazy data visualization. Like I didn't see the colorful one until the end. And I was envisioning maybe icons, and I was envisioning like, I don't know, in my head, it was going to be completely different. And like you said, it wasn't that different. So in a way, it's good that like very little changes that you make to your logic model can have impact. But also I don't know, I think about maybe what if you, I don't know, shorten because I know in data viz also like less is more. So then the text in the original versus the new one is the same. So I wonder if you modify the text, that would also make some changes, or if you bold some letters, or if you like, I envisioned a lot more data viz principles in it. And then when I saw it, I was surprised in a way. But like I said, I mean, it's good that just very little changes can have a big impact. But that was my takeaway from it.
No, and you probably heard me say that at the beginning as well, that it surprised me. But I think, you know, as I've been sitting here pondering this more and more from an experimental mind frame, like this seems to be a good first step, because it'd be really hard to know what variables are impacting these variables, or what changes are impacting the variables they're measuring, if we do incorporate a good deal of data visualization techniques. So, I mean, it looks like what they were going for. Hey, if we just do these simple changes, how does that impact visual efficiency, aesthetics, all of those? But I'm totally on board with you, right? The data viz principle that always sticks out in my head is the data to ink ratio, right? The less ink you have on the page, the easier it is for people to understand and remember. So the lengthy descriptions, I say lengthy, they're not even that lengthy, but any way to chop those down, you could see being effective. I didn't even think about bolding words. I don't think I've ever done that in logic model. I'm totally stealing that from you. So good point. I love it. Anyone else? I know we're at 12:30, but we love logic models, so if you have something to say.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I was going to add too is that I think the visualization could be really helpful, you know, if you do have a more collaborative evaluation that you're doing with a partner, whereas, you know what you as like an evaluator or as an evaluation team, you are able to provide as an input versus the visualization can be a good clarifying tool as far as, this organization or this program I'm evaluating, this is also what could be color coded. This is what I need from you to successfully complete the evaluation, whether it be documents, whether it be time and effort, whether it be, like just consistent communication. So I like the idea of like using the visualization to also demonstrate like, how tasks are delegated in a more collaborative evaluation model. So.
Yeah, that's great. Jay, I'm sitting here thinking, what little tweaks could be done to this that the person we're making it with and for could take it away and use it as, okay, I need somebody to recruit youth, involve youth and adults, and I need to figure out who the educator is. That's my role in this giant program. And yeah, I have the logic model could, with little tweaks, turn into essentially an action plan to some degree. Brilliant. Another thing I'm going to steal. So, well, if there's nothing else, I'll put it out there one more time. I know everybody's busy, but I could talk about them all day. So, one more. All right. Well, folks, it's always a pleasure to have you on these calls. Maybe I just love talking about evaluation too much, but either way, we'll be here next month, same bat time, same bat place. So be on the lookout for whatever it is. If you have a particular article that you're interested in us talking about, please send it my way. You can see that actually presenting on it takes very little effort or knowledge, as by my display of requisite expertise. So if you want to talk about an article, then please chime in and we'll make it happen. But until then, have a wonderful day and week.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Bye, gang.